Snow fell quietly on Christmas morning as 19-year-old Ren Ashby stood at the end of her parents' driveway, holding a single black trash bag filled with everything she still owned. The freezing wind cut through her thin coat, but it wasn't the cold that hurt the most. Behind her, Roger Ashby shut the front door without a second thought, making it clear she was no longer welcome. Her mother Linda stayed inside and never even stepped onto the porch. From the front window, her younger sister Kayla smiled, waved with a mocking grin and silently mouthed, "Bye, Ren," before disappearing from sight. In just a few minutes, the place Ren had called home her entire life no longer belonged to her. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing people from different places joining these stories. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another one. At that moment, Ren truly believed her life had fallen apart. She had only $11 in her pocket, no car, no job waiting for her, and nowhere to spend Christmas Day. The small trash bag in her hands was all her parents had allowed her to take. Everything else stayed behind those locked doors as if she had never existed. The reason was as painful as it was simple. Roger wanted access to the college fund Ren's late grandfather had spent years building for her future. His gambling debts had grown beyond control, and he expected his daughter to sacrifice everything so he could escape the consequences of his own choices. Ren refused to sign the papers. She knew the money represented years of her grandfather's love and hard work, and she would not throw it away. Instead of respecting her decision, her family turned against her. Roger called her selfish. Linda stood silently beside him. Kayla acted as though losing her sister was some kind of joke. With one final argument, Ren was pushed out of the only home she had ever known. Standing alone in the snow, she thought she had lost everything that mattered. She couldn't imagine that the darkest morning of her life was quietly leading her toward a future none of them could have predicted. The secret her grandfather left behind would soon change everything, while the people laughing at her that Christmas would one day struggle to look her in the eye. To understand why Ren ended up standing alone in the snow on Christmas morning, you have to go back 3 days. The truth had been growing inside that house for months, hidden behind forced smiles and quiet excuses. Roger Ashby had borrowed money over and over to feed his gambling habit, convincing himself he would win enough to pay everyone back. Instead, every loss pulled him deeper into trouble. By the week of Christmas, he owed $40,000 to a dangerous bookie named Frank Delaney. The friendly reminders had turned into serious threats, and Roger knew time was running out. Linda had known about the debt for months. She had seen the unpaid bills, the late-night phone calls, and the fear on Roger's face whenever another message arrived. She wanted the problem to disappear, but she never challenged him. Years of living with his angry outbursts had taught her that staying quiet felt safer than speaking up, even when silence hurt someone else. Kayla, only 17, lived in a completely different world. As the younger child and her father's favorite, she rarely questioned anything happening around her. Whenever Roger blamed Ren for family problems, Kayla accepted his version without asking for the full story. She honestly believed her older sister always made life difficult for everyone else. 2 nights before Christmas, the family gathered around the dinner table. The meal barely started before Roger placed several papers in front of Ren. He calmly explained that all she needed to do was sign them. The documents would transfer control of the $52,000 college fund that her grandfather, Earl Whitmore, had built for her since she was a baby. Roger promised it was only temporary and claimed he would replace every dollar later. Ren looked at the papers without touching them. She remembered her grandfather talking about education as the one gift nobody could ever take away. She knew exactly what that money meant. It was never meant to rescue Roger from the consequences of his own decisions. When she quietly refused, the room changed in an instant. Roger accused her of caring more about money than family. Linda called her ungrateful after everything her parents had done for her. Kayla sighed, rolled her eyes and muttered, "It's not that deep. Just sign it." No one asked Ren how she felt or why she said no. Sitting there, surrounded by the people who should have protected her, she finally understood a painful truth. She hadn't become alone that night. She had been alone in that family for far longer than she had ever wanted to admit. After walking for what felt like hours, Ren finally reached a quiet bus stop on the edge of town. Snow continued falling, covering the empty streets in white as she sat down on the freezing metal bench. Her fingers were numb, and the trash bag resting beside her suddenly felt much heavier than it should have. She stared at passing cars, wondering where she would sleep that night. For the first time since leaving home, the reality of her situation settled in. She had nowhere to go and no one to call. Trying to distract herself, Ren opened the trash bag and searched for an extra sweater. As she moved through the pile of clothes, something slipped onto her lap. It was a Christmas card with her name written in familiar handwriting. She froze the moment she recognized it. The card had been mailed by her grandfather, Earl Whitmore, only a few weeks before he passed away from a heart attack the previous spring. She remembered receiving it months earlier. The loss had been so painful that she couldn't bring herself to read his final message. She had only looked at the front before putting it away in a drawer, promising herself she would open it when she felt ready. That day never came, and somehow the unopened card ended up buried among her belongings. Now, sitting alone in the cold with nothing left to lose, Ren carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a neatly folded handwritten letter, a small brass key wrapped in tissue paper, and one short sentence written across the top of the page. For the day they show you who they really are. Her eyes filled with tears as she read every word. Earl told her he loved her and hoped she would never need what he had prepared. He admitted he had quietly worried for years that Roger's poor decisions would eventually place Ren in danger. He never wanted his granddaughter's future to depend on anyone else's choices, so he had spent more than a decade making careful plans without telling the rest of the family. Near the end of the letter, Earl explained the purpose of the brass key. It belonged to a safety deposit box waiting for her at First Heritage Bank downtown. Everything she needed to understand was inside. He asked her to go there if the day ever came when the people closest to her chose selfishness over love. Ren lowered the letter and looked at the small key resting in her palm. Just an hour earlier she believed her story had ended in that snowy driveway. Now, thanks to one unopened Christmas card, she realized her grandfather had quietly been preparing a different ending all along. The next morning, Ren woke before sunrise, still tired from spending the night in a small waiting area near the bus station. She folded her grandfather's letter, slipped the brass key safely into her pocket, and started walking toward First Heritage Bank. The cold air stung her face with every step, but she kept moving. It was nearly 2 miles across town and she had no money to waste on transportation. As she walked through the quiet streets, she kept wondering what could possibly be inside the safety deposit box that Earl had guarded for so many years. When she finally reached the bank, her clothes were damp from melting snow and her hands were freezing. She approached the front desk and explained everything as calmly as she could. The employee listened carefully before introducing her to the branch manager, Diane Petrov. Diane noticed Ren's shaking hands and gently offered her a warm cup of coffee while checking the records connected to Earl Whitmore's account. A few minutes later, Diane smiled kindly and confirmed what Ren never expected to hear. Ever since her 18th birthday, she had been listed as the only authorized beneficiary with full legal access to the safety deposit box. Everything inside belonged to her alone. Diane unlocked the vault and left Ren with the box in a private room. Taking a slow breath, Ren lifted the lid. Inside were several carefully organized folders, each labeled in Earl's neat handwriting. She found property deeds, an envelope containing stock certificates, and detailed financial statements for a trust fund her grandfather had quietly built throughout her entire childhood. Her heart raced as she read the numbers. The trust alone was worth $190,000. It was more money than she had ever imagined having. Tears filled her eyes, not because of the amount, but because she realized how deeply her grandfather had believed in her future. Beneath the documents rested another handwritten letter. Earl explained that he had kept everything secret because he never trusted Roger to leave it alone. He feared that if anyone learned about the trust, they would eventually pressure Ren into giving it away. He wanted her education, security, and independence protected no matter what happened inside the family. The final page contained the names of 3 people Earl trusted completely. Each person had agreed to help Ren if she ever needed guidance. One name immediately stood out. It belonged to Patricia Nguyen, an admissions advisor at Callaway State University. Earl wrote that if Ren ever decided to study law, Patricia would know exactly how to help her begin. For the first time since leaving home, Ren felt something stronger than fear. He felt hope. Ren never considered going back to her parents' house. After everything that had happened, she knew nothing had changed except her understanding of who they really were. She didn't call Roger, Linda, or Kayla, and no calls came from them either. The silence was painful, but it also gave her room to think. Using a small part of the money now available to her, she rented a simple motel room for 2 weeks. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm, safe, and quiet. For the first time since Christmas morning, she could lock a door behind her and know no one was going to throw her out. Every evening, she spread her grandfather's letters across the small table beside the window and read them again. Each sentence felt like a conversation she never got to finish with him. Earl hadn't only left her financial security. He had left her confidence at a time when she had almost forgotten how to believe in herself. His words reminded her that her future was still hers to shape. As she sat alone one afternoon, another memory returned from years earlier. When she was a little girl, she and Earl spent many Sunday afternoons watching courtroom programs together. While other kids wanted cartoons, Ren loved listening to lawyers explain complicated problems and watching judges make difficult decisions. Earl always smiled whenever she guessed what would happen next. He had a favorite saying that made her laugh every time. "You've got the mind for it, Rennie. You always ask the right questions." Back then she thought he was simply being a proud grandfather. Now those words sounded completely different. They felt less like encouragement and more like a path he had quietly hoped she would one day choose. The next morning, Ren looked at the list of trusted contacts Earl had placed inside the safety deposit box. Her eyes stopped on the name Patricia Nguyen, an admissions advisor at Callaway State University. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and called. Patricia answered with a warm voice. The moment Ren mentioned Earl Whitmore, there was a long pause before Patricia softly said she had known him for years through his volunteer work at the university. She spoke about him with genuine respect and listened carefully as Ren explained everything that had happened over Christmas. Patricia never interrupted or judged her. Instead, she told Ren that Earl had often spoken proudly about his granddaughter and believed she had the ability to succeed in law. Before ending the conversation, Patricia encouraged Ren to submit an application to the university's pre-law program immediately. She promised to guide her through every step of the process and answer any questions along the way. That same week, Ren completed every form, gathered every document, and officially applied. For the first time in days, she wasn't thinking about the home she had lost. She was focused on the life she was beginning to build. Instead of letting her family's rejection define her future, she chose to honor the faith her grandfather had placed in her, taking the first real step toward becoming the woman he had always believed she could be. The months that followed were nothing like the dramatic moments that had changed Ren's life. There were no sudden miracles or easy victories. Instead, every day became another small step forward. After being accepted into Callaway State's pre-law program, she rented a modest apartment close to campus. The place was small with old furniture and plain walls, but to Ren it felt like freedom. Every bill was paid through her own careful planning, and every decision belonged to her. Although the trust Earl left behind gave her security, Ren refused to depend on it for everything. She wanted to build a future through her own effort, so she found a part-time job at a neighborhood coffee shop. The owner, Bev Castellano, believed in hard work and honest people. She expected everyone to arrive on time, treat customers with respect, and never make excuses. Ren appreciated that. Bev never asked uncomfortable questions about her past. She simply noticed that Ren worked hard and quietly trusted her with more responsibility as the months passed. Balancing work and school was exhausting. Some mornings started before sunrise, and many nights ended with textbooks spread across her kitchen table long after midnight. There were days when she wondered if she was pushing herself too hard, but every completed assignment reminded her why she had started. She wasn't trying to prove her family wrong anymore. She was proving to herself that their opinions had never defined her abilities. Her professors quickly noticed her dedication. Ren prepared carefully for every class, participated in discussions, and never hesitated to ask thoughtful questions. She remembered what Earl had always told her about asking the right questions, and those words stayed with her whenever she doubted herself. During those 18 months, she never contacted Roger, Linda, or Kayla. They never reached out to her either. The silence between them became part of her new normal. Occasionally, a cousin would send a short message with family news. Roger's gambling problems had become public and creditors were demanding payment. The family home had been listed for a short sale because they could no longer keep up with the mortgage. Kayla had quietly dropped out of community college after struggling through the semester. Whenever Ren heard these updates, she expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, she felt something much calmer. There was sadness for what her family had become, but there was no desire to celebrate their hardship. Their choices had created those consequences, and she knew nothing she did could change that. Rather than looking backward, Ren stayed focused on the path ahead. She worked her shifts, attended every lecture, studied whenever she could, and slowly built a life based on discipline instead of fear. The girl who had stood alone in the snow with a trash bag of clothes was disappearing, replaced by someone stronger with every passing month. She wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. She was creating a future where she no longer needed one. When Ren began her second semester, she felt different from the frightened girl who had arrived on campus months earlier. She was still working long hours and studying every chance she had, but she finally believed she belonged where she was. That confidence showed during a mock trial competition held by the university. Ren prepared carefully, studied every detail of the case, and presented her arguments with calm confidence. She wasn't the loudest student in the room, but she was thoughtful, organized, and impossible to distract. Among the judges watching the competition was the Honorable Diane Castor, one of the most respected judges in the county. She paid close attention as Ren questioned witnesses, challenged weak arguments, and stayed composed under pressure. After the event ended, Judge Castor asked to speak with her privately. She complimented Ren's preparation and offered her an internship in her chambers for the coming semester. Ren could hardly believe what she was hearing. She accepted immediately, knowing the opportunity could shape her future. Working for Judge Castor was challenging from the very first day. The judge expected excellence in every task, whether it involved researching legal cases, organizing files, or preparing written summaries. She corrected mistakes directly but always explained how to improve. Ren appreciated that honesty. For the first time in years, an adult expected great things from her instead of criticizing everything she did. The internship also introduced Ren to another law student named Sam Reyes. He was serving as an intern in the same office and quickly became someone she enjoyed working beside. Sam had an easygoing personality that balanced Ren's serious nature. They often reviewed case materials together, shared coffee during breaks, and encouraged each other through difficult assignments. What mattered most to Ren was that Sam never pushed her to talk about her past. He respected her privacy and allowed their friendship to grow naturally. As the weeks passed, Ren became more confident in her work. Judge Castor noticed the progress and trusted her with increasingly important responsibilities. One afternoon, after reviewing a legal brief Ren had written, the judge called her into the office. She placed the papers on her desk and looked at Ren for a long moment before speaking. "You don't write like someone who's had an easy life," she said. "Good. That's an advantage in this profession, not a weakness." The words stayed with Ren long after she left the office. For years, she had believed the painful parts of her life were something to hide. Judge Castor helped her see them differently. The hardships she had survived had taught her patience, compassion, and the ability to recognize unfairness. Those experiences gave her a deeper understanding of people than any textbook ever could. Walking home that evening, Ren realized she was no longer running from her past. She was using it to become exactly the kind of person her grandfather had always believed she could be. While Ren continued moving forward, life back in her hometown was falling apart. News reached her only through distant relatives who occasionally sent short messages. She never asked for updates, but every now and then someone would mention another problem involving Roger. His gambling debts had grown beyond anything he could control, and the people he owed money to were no longer willing to wait. Frank Delaney's associates began showing up in places where Roger couldn't ignore them. Everything finally became public after an embarrassing incident at Roger's workplace. Several men confronted him in front of coworkers and customers, demanding payment he couldn't provide. The scene spread quickly through town, damaging his reputation and costing him the little respect he still had. By the end of that week, everyone knew the truth about the debts he had tried to hide for so long. Linda had spent years hoping things would somehow improve, but the public humiliation forced her to face reality. She realized that protecting Roger had only allowed the situation to grow worse. After months of fear and disappointment, she filed for legal separation. It wasn't a sudden decision. It was simply the point where she could no longer pretend their marriage could be saved. Kayla was struggling as well. At 18, she had discovered that life became much harder when people stopped solving problems for her. Without Ren around to quietly carry responsibilities, she found herself facing challenges she didn't know how to handle. Then one afternoon, Ren's phone rang with a number she almost didn't recognize. It was Kayla. For the first time in more than a year, the sisters spoke again. Ren listened quietly, wondering if this was finally the conversation she had imagined during lonely nights after leaving home. Maybe Kayla wanted to apologize. Maybe she wanted to admit what happened on Christmas had been wrong. Instead, after only a few minutes of awkward conversation, Kayla asked if Ren could lend her some money. She promised she would pay it back someday, but she never acknowledged the pain she had helped cause. She spoke as though the past had simply disappeared. Ren closed her eyes for a moment before answering. Her voice stayed calm. "No, Kayla. I can't do that." There was a long silence before Kayla quietly ended the call. Ren placed her phone on the table and waited for the sadness she expected to feel. Surprisingly, it never came. Instead, she noticed a sense of peace settling over her. Saying no had not made her cruel. It had simply reminded her that protecting herself was no longer something she needed to apologize for. Later that evening, she shared the conversation with Sam as they walked home together. After listening quietly, he asked how she felt. Ren smiled gently and looked ahead. "I used to think forgiving them meant going back," she said. "I don't think that anymore." In that moment, she understood something important. She didn't need an apology to move on. She was already building a life that no longer depended on one. 18 months passed faster than Ren ever expected. The painful memories of that Christmas morning never completely disappeared, but they no longer controlled her life. Every class she completed, every shift she worked, and every lesson she learned under Judge Castor brought her one step closer to the future she had chosen for herself. By the time graduation arrived, she had earned the highest academic standing in her pre-law cohort. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she thought briefly about her grandfather. She wished he could have been sitting in the audience, smiling the way he always had whenever she achieved something important. After the ceremony, Judge Castor asked Ren to meet in her office. Ren assumed they would simply discuss future plans, but the conversation became something much bigger. Judge Castor explained that an unexpected opening had become available for a municipal judge in the same county where Ren had grown up. It was an unusual opportunity because people her age were almost never considered for such a position. However, after watching Ren's work ethic, judgment, and commitment over the previous months, Judge Castor believed she was ready. She had already submitted a personal recommendation supporting Ren's appointment. The news left Ren speechless. She knew the responsibility would be enormous, but she also understood what it meant. Someone she respected believed she had earned this chance through ability rather than luck. After completing the required clerkship process and final evaluations, the appointment became official. In a small county, important news traveled quickly. Before long, people throughout the community were talking about the young judge who had grown up there. Linda heard the news first from a neighbor while checking her mailbox. At first, she laughed because she thought it had to be a misunderstanding. Her daughter couldn't possibly be the same frightened teenager who had left home carrying a trash bag. But later that day, she searched for the official announcement herself. Seeing Ren's name in print, she stood silently, unable to deny the truth. Roger learned about it in a way that stung even more. During a conversation about his unpaid debts, Frank Delaney made a bitter joke, saying it was ironic that Roger's own daughter was about to become one of the people responsible for upholding the law in their county. Roger forced a weak smile, but inside he felt something he had never expected. Pride mixed with deep regret. Kayla discovered the announcement on a public county notice. She stared at her sister's name for several moments without speaking. Memories of that Christmas morning came rushing back, along with the words she wished she had never said. Days passed after the announcement, but Ren's phone remained silent. No congratulations arrived. No apology appeared. None of them reached out because none of them knew how to begin. Ren noticed the silence, accepted it, and continued preparing for the next chapter of her life, knowing she had reached this moment through determination, not their approval. Several weeks after Ren's appointment became official, an ordinary civil case appeared on the court calendar. It involved a financial dispute connected to unpaid obligations, nothing unusual for the courthouse. Ren reviewed the case files the evening before, giving them the same careful attention she gave every matter placed before her. She had learned from Judge Castor that every person deserved fairness, no matter who they were or what mistakes they had made. She had no reason to believe the next morning would be different. When the courtroom began to fill, Roger Ashby entered quietly and took a seat. Years of poor decisions had finally brought him there. His shoulders looked heavier than Wren remembered, and the confidence he once carried had disappeared. He glanced toward the judge's bench without paying much attention to the name printed on the schedule. Then the courtroom clerk announced, "All rise." Wren entered wearing her judicial robe, calm and focused. She took her seat with the same quiet professionalism she showed every day. As she looked across the room, her eyes met Roger's for only a brief moment. The shock on his face was impossible to miss. For a second neither of them moved. Then Roger lowered his eyes to the floor. The man who had once ordered his daughter out of the house could no longer meet her gaze. Wren felt many memories pass through her mind, but none of them changed the way she performed her job. She did not mention their relationship. She did not allow emotion to influence her decisions. She listened carefully to both sides, asked thoughtful questions, and applied the law exactly as she had promised herself she always would. Every person in the courtroom received the same respect and impartial treatment. When the hearing ended, Wren gathered her notes and left through the hallway outside the courtroom. Linda was standing there alone. The moment she saw Wren, tears filled her eyes. She opened her mouth several times, searching for words that never seemed to come. There were years of regret between them, but no sentence could erase what had happened on that snowy Christmas morning. Wren stopped for only a moment. "I hope things get better for you," she said gently. There was no anger in her voice and no satisfaction. She simply wished Linda well, then continued walking without waiting for a response. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected across the parking lot. Sam Reyes was leaning against his car, holding 2 cups of coffee with a smile that immediately made the long day feel lighter. He handed one to Wren as they walked away together. She never looked back at the courthouse. The greatest victory was never becoming more successful than her family or watching them face the consequences of their own choices. It was building a life filled with purpose, dignity, and peace. The people who once laughed as she walked away with nothing could no longer look her in the eye, while she moved forward without needing their approval, their apology, or their permission ever again.